terms BC and AD. Many believe that AD stands for after death, but it actually comes from the Latin phrase Anno Domini, which means year of the Lord. It is believed that history should be divided by the greatest event in human history, being the birth of Jesus Christ. So all the time after the birth of Jesus Christ became known as AD, and all of history before the birth of Jesus Christ was labeled BC, before Christ. This could be considered the great dividing line in history, the moment when before turned into after, but it is not. Some might also think that it is the page that separates the Old Testament from the New Testament. It's not that either. The great dividing line in history is before the resurrection of Jesus Christ and after the resurrection of Jesus Christ. With Christ's resurrection comes new realities that change everything. In the Gospels, one could say that the story of Jesus Christ begins and ends with swaddling clothes and burial linens. But if we were to consider the entire Bible and the history of civilization, one could then say that the story of Jesus Christ and God's relationship with humankind begins and ends in a garden. It's no coincidence that Jesus' tomb was in a garden. In recognizing this, we're meant to remember that the entire story of the Bible begins in the Garden of Eden. And it was in the Garden of Eden that the devil tempted Adam and Eve to disobey God, bringing sin, evil, death, and broken relationships with God into the world. And ever since, humanity has been enslaved in self-interest and disobedience, as well as guilt and shame. The first human, or the first Adam, was a gardener, but he fell. And because of his disobedience, he was forced out of the garden. But in the garden, where Jesus' tomb was located, we see the reversal of what happened in the Garden of Eden. And that gets to the point as to why God had come into this world as a human being. In the Bible, Jesus is called the second Adam, which means that he came into the world to undo what the first Adam, or the first human, messed up. And Jesus died the death that we deserve because of the original sin, in order that through faith in Christ, those who believe will be lifted up or resurrected with Jesus and will never die. Jesus is our atoning sacrifice. He is our forgiveness. He is our life. On the first Easter morning, the grave of this world turned into a garden with Jesus as the tree of life. And all who eat from this tree of life shall never die. It should come as no surprise to us that when Mary Magdalene first looked at Jesus that morning at the tomb, that she thought he was a gardener. In many ways, that's exactly who he is. Jesus asked Mary why she was crying, who she was looking for. That's when Mary, thinking he was the gardener, she replied and said, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you put him, and I will get him." And then Jesus called out her name, Mary. The Apostle John tells us that at that moment, she turned. It's another way of saying that she was converted, because at that moment, she recognized him as Jesus Christ, the Lord. On this Easter morning, as we come together to worship the Lord of Lords and King of Kings, we are surrounded on all sides by homes with people in them. Some are probably still fast asleep. Others may be filling baskets and hiding eggs. Others might be surfing the internet or reading the Sunday paper. But what are they thinking about? What are their lives like? The majority of folks around us today will not take part in worship service this morning. Many of the people living in this community have never eaten from the tree of life. Easter morning means nothing to them unless they have kids. Then it means spending money on Easter candy and Easter gifts and Easter eggs. For all intent and purposes, they're living in the time before the resurrection of Christ. They're still in the time where there is no choice that can be seen other to be enslaved in sin and disobedience, frustration and death. They're still living in the time that Mary Magdalene had been living in before she turned. They're still living in the time when Jesus looked like another guy, another person, no different than the first person who ever lived, a gardener. But just as Jesus called Mary's name, Jesus is calling those who are still asleep on this Easter morning. And whoever will turn, whoever will bow down and worship him, they too are raised to new life. We are the Church of Jesus Christ. And as the Church of Jesus Christ, we are called to come together to worship the living Christ. But we are not called to stay locked up behind the walls of our building. After experiencing Christ, we are to do what Mary did when she recognized Jesus for who he is. Remember what Mary did when she saw Jesus at the tomb? She ran. Mary ran to tell others. In Matthew chapter 9, we are also told that Jesus went through all towns and villages. And when he saw crowds, he had compassion on them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus said to his disciples, "What a huge harvest, and how few harvest hands. So on your knees, ask the God of the harvest to send harvest hands." We're not only to ask God to send out workers into the neighborhoods surrounding this church building. We are to go to be the workers ourselves. Immediately after his resurrection, Mary mistook Jesus to be a gardener. Could it be that things happen this way so that God could tell us, "I've begun the work of restoring the garden. Now you are to join me. You are to continue the work that the resurrected Christ began." We are to help Christ restore the garden by going into all the world making disciples and teaching them the things that God is teaching us. We are called to restore the garden by pulling out the weeds of injustice and hate and poverty and self-centeredness. We are called to restore the garden by sowing seeds of God's compassion, mercy, and love. Amen.
Amen.
If you would please stand now for our closing song, "Because He Lives."